we realized in the organization over the last few years that we noticed that photoacoustics is grown vastly. Unfortunately, it's not grown vastly within the IUS, so we've been trying to make a special effort to try to increase the visibility of it. This builds off of the observation from last year. In 2018, we had a joint spotlight session, and we realized that photoacoustics is actually very special to our organization because it actually crosses multiple of our groups. It crosses medical ultrasonics, sensors, physical acoustics, and transducers. So we wanted to put special emphasis into this year. We're also going to have, as Laurie mentioned, a special session after the coffee break, where we're going to bring in international renowned speakers and invited speakers, and following two regular sessions, we're going to have a panel discussion that should give a lot of visibility and energy to the field. And so basically the objective here is that we want to build critical mass in the photoacoustics effort at this meeting here, and if at all possible we would like that to be something that persists into the future. So it's my great honor to present the opening plenary speaker, Lihong Wang. In choosing a speaker, we're obviously looking for a world-renowned speaker in a field, high-growth area of great interest to our society. So Lihong Wang earned his PhD at Rice University, and then he rapidly rose through academic ranks at the University of Texas MD Anderson, Texas A&M, Washington University of Louis, and now the Bren Professor at Caltech. Frequently, always recognized as one of the top 3 technical universities in the world. So few would question Lihong's impact, but I think really the metrics say it all. You know, I checked Google even just this morning, and his H-index is over 130, and a total of over 70,000 citations. He's given over 500 plenary lectures, and has over 500 journal articles in absolute top-tier journals such as Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Society. Proceedings of the National Academy of Society. He's also a fellow at IEEE, the Optical Society of America, SPIE, and the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineers. He's also in 2018 became a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the ultimate level of recognition within the United States. As an educator, he's written a book that won the 2010 Joseph Goodman Book Award, and he also wrote and distributed the open source software that's widely used in the field of Monte Carlo simulation for photon transport. In service, Professor Wang has given lots of service in terms of organizing photoacoustic meetings and grant review, and also he's also organized many of these meetings. I cannot summarize all of his technical accomplishments. I think you're going to get a good flavor in this talk. But what's really captivated me is his pursuit of really bold goals to go big and to go after things which seem, on the face of it, very difficult, such as imaging through, photoacoustic imaging through bone. So with that, I'd like to introduce Lihong Wang, who will present on the world's deepest penetration and fastest optical cameras.
Well, thank you, Cherng, for inviting me to present our work here, for a very kind introduction as well. Thank you all for coming to my talk. So I'll be talking about photoacoustic tomography and compressed ultrafast photography. We try to overcome two of the key challenges in optical imaging. In fact, this is my second trip to Glasgow this year. I learned that Lord Kelvin was on the faculty of the University of Glasgow. Also, the piezoelectric balance was presented by Pierre Curie to Lord Kelvin. In fact, now it's actually housed at a local museum, so this might be worth seeing. Why do we work on optical imaging? The fundamental reason is that we have molecular specificity. In other words, using light, we can differentiate different molecules, such as oxy and deoxyhemoglobin molecules. This is because that, fundamentally speaking, light-matter interaction occurs at a molecular level. You know, if you look at a very broad EM spectrum, light occupies this tiny region. That's the only region where we have molecular specificity. Given the fundamental roles of molecules in biomedicine, we really have to work on this problem, despite all the challenges we face. By detecting molecules, we can provide in vivo functional imaging, very similar to functional MRI. In vivo metabolic imaging is similar to PET. In vivo molecular imaging of gene expressions or disease markers, even in vivo label-free histologic imaging of cancer without tissue excision. So we have this list of powerful capabilities, but we face daunting challenges. First of all, turbidity is ubiquitous. If you look at the world, essentially everything is turbid to some extent because everything is scattering except vacuum. Even clarity is relative because we define clarity as relatively low scattering. If you look at a person, with the exception of our eye maybe, every tissue is kind of scattering. Most biological tissue are extremely scattering. The other challenge we face is light travels at a high speed. Nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. If you want to image the supersonic Mach cone, which is an acoustic phenomenon, we can use light, because light can travel faster. But if you want to image something, the counterpart of supersonic Mach cone, which is called superluminal Mach cone, and we have to use light. And in fact, in this case, we have no way to resolve the cone structure because everything happens so fast. So how do we conquer those two key challenges in optical imaging? Now, if you look at the key problem with tissue penetration by using light, and the movie shows you how photons propagate in biological tissue, within the top 1 millimeter, photons still travel in a ballistic fashion. So you can use what we call ballistic imaging to retrieve spatial information. Beyond about 1 millimeter, the photon propagation leads to diffusion, basically your random walk fashion, and so you can no longer use the ballistic photons. There are so few of them, you can't really go above the signal to the noise level, so there's no sufficient signal to noise ratio for you to do ballistic imaging. And we have to use the multiple scatter photons. The problem is when photons have gone through a random walk, you can't really have any high spatial information. So that has been a challenge for decades. If you go back to the beginning of optical imaging about 350 years ago when conventional microscopy was invented, it provides fantastic spatial resolution, but penetration is limited to about 100 microns, which is called the aberration limit. And that's one mean-free path in biological tissue. By using laser or coherent properties of light, we can provide much deeper penetration, roughly by 10-fold. And this is where the diffusion limit kicks in. That's a 1 transfer mean-free path, or 10 times the mean-free path. Now, where do we go from here? Because from there on, from about 1 millimeter and deeper, we deal with highly diffusive photons. We use photoacoustics. So really, ultrasound has played a key role in biomedical optics, where we combine optical contrast with ultrasonic resolution for quite deep tissue penetration. And now we're talking about human organ level or whole body small animal level as well for imaging purposes. Like anything else, even photoacoustics faces the next challenge. This is where we call dissipation limit, where the light gets quite dim at a given level. Is there a solution even to this problem? In fact, there's a very active field called time reversal. We try to have a guide star at a very deep depth, and we try to corral photons to that depth to generate hotspots. And this is still quite early for practical use. So I always tell people this is very exciting but equally challenging, so we have to wait and see. Today I'll focus on photoacoustic tomography. So let me start with photoacoustic computed tomography. In photoacoustics, you start with light. Light will diffuse into tissue. You really don't depend on ballistic photons. When light gets absorbed, due to light absorption coefficient mu A, the absorption coefficient, defined as the probability of absorption per unit length, there's some thermal conversion. There's almost always some thermal conversion. Even when the molecules are fluorescent, part of the energy goes to the thermal channel. So all molecules are essentially detectable using photoacoustics. There's a temperature rise as a result, which will give rise to an initial pressure rise. Due to the spatial gradient, this pressure rise will launch an acoustic wave, usually ultrasonic wave if we use a short enough laser pulse, or we use intensity modulation to achieve the same goal. So mathematically, we can look at this very simple equation. The initial pressure is proportional to the optical absorption coefficient mu A and times the thermal conversion coefficient. So even though we're measuring pressure, acoustic property, but we're indirectly reflecting the optical properties. So we get optical contrast through the detection of acoustic signals. And the movie shows you an ideal example when you have a tiny spherical sphere. You can get this bipolar signal, which is basically a signature of what we detect. In photoacoustic CT, we start with a broadened laser beam. We have to stay safe. There's an ANSI safety limit we have to follow, and we typically use nanosecond laser pulses. We allow photons to scatter. When photons are absorbed, it generates very rapid heating. Every millidegree gives you a detectable signal already, 800 pascals. And in fact, this is already, if you detect it right at the source, you already get a signal-to-noise ratio maybe 10 to 1, maybe even 100 to 1. And so if you heat up to about a degree, you get a very good signal-to-noise ratio to work with. And what we do differently from pure optical imaging is instead of detecting return photons, we detect the return acoustic signals, the photoacoustic signals. Because ultrasonic scattering is orders of magnitude weaker than optical scattering. As a result, we can form very sharp images, ultrasonic diffraction limited images, yet we're retrieving optical contrast. Again, we're combining optical contrast with ultrasonic resolution in a single hybrid modality. We do have to solve some math problems, and this is similar to X-ray CT, except that we deal with a much more complex problem, I have to say. We call this read-on transform in the forward problem, even though read-on never solved it, inverted this problem, we named this after him. And so except that we're dealing with a spherical read-on transform, where in X-ray CT we deal with a linear read-on transform. So we have extra dimension, we deal with a curved surface. If we have a 3D unknown object, we bathe the object essentially with photons. Volumetrically, we generate a volumetric source. You know, as far as the ultrasonic detection is concerned, we're dealing with an instantaneous sound source. That basically defines our time zero. So for a given detector on the detection surface at time t after we fire our short laser pulse, you can define a radius v sub s times t. So this radius defines a spherical shell on which landing took place. A spherical shell on which we integrate all the initial pressure P naught. And so that integration is called a spherical read-on transformation. Now we have to invert it. So in the early days, you know, our field really worked very hard. We find a solution for each geometry, but it turned out there's a universal solution for all three standard geometries. And this looks actually very similar to the ultrasound imaging community. And so in order to unify all the different detection geometries, we use the solid angle to unify them. And so d omega naught is the solid angle element. And we have to properly time delay the signal. So you have this time delay depending on the locations. If you use the initial pressure, if you use the detected pressure P at different locations, you basically get something very close to beamforming in ultrasound. But if we include the high frequency or the time derivative component, we can get an exact solution which recovers the initial pressure P naught. So this is in fact, quite straightforward, but yet very, very powerful. And this remains one of the most used algorithms in our field. In 2003, we reported the first functional photoacoustic images, also the first in vivo photoacoustic images. In small animals, by keeping the scalp and skull intact, we can send light through both of them and reach the brain cortex to excite photoacoustic signals. By looking at hemodynamic changes, we can reveal the function. By whisking one side of the whiskers, the contralateral side of the brain was hemodynamically activated. And so we can see the signal very much like bold MRI. And so since the publication of this paper, you can see the growth of our field. Roughly about every 3 to 4 years, our field was doubled in size. The conference on this topic has become the largest at Photonics West, which has 20,000 attendees every year. The peer-reviewed papers has continued to grow exponentially. In fact, since last year, there was over 1,000 papers published, more than 28,000 citations per year. And so you can see this has become a massive field. Due to the contributions of both the optics community and the ultrasonics community mainly, and even the chemistry community because they're making contrast agents for this technology. And there are a number of companies, this is a partial list of the companies that, to my knowledge, you can see they were really happy to see the industry efforts in commercializing this technology. One of the key features of photoacoustic tomography is probably, this is the only omniscale in vivo imaging modality that allows us to provide consistent contrast because we always image light absorption as the contrast mechanism, yet allows us to image from organelles, maybe even starting from the protein level, through cells, tissues, all the way to organisms in small animals or human organs. And I'm plotting the imaging depth versus the spatial resolution. You see this dashed line that roughly connects all the different implementations. So this provides a very wide range of scalability. You do have this trade-off to play because you cannot get the deepest penetration and highest absolute resolution, but your number of pixels in the depth direction is roughly a constant, which is about 200. If you look at standard practice in biomedicine, cells and below, prefer to use optical microscopy, so you're looking at optical contrast. But from tissues and above, we switch to non-optics because standard optical imaging will not give you the right penetration. So there's a huge divide between the cell and tissue levels because we're talking about different contrast mechanisms. Now finally, we're able to use the same contrast to connect all the length scales of relevance. Hopefully, we can provide a tool for omniscale biological research from organelles to organisms. And more importantly, maybe we can accelerate the translation of microscopic lab discoveries to macroscopic clinical practice. So finally, we were able to image really fast. For the O3 work, we used a single element transducer. We had to rotate around the small animal, which took about 20 minutes to get a 2D cross-sectional image. Obviously, that's too slow. And we can provide a single laser impulse that gives you a tomographic 2D image within basically the acoustic transit time. So that is extremely fast. So let's see how we can do this. This system is for small animal imaging, and we can use it for trunk imaging. Use the right laser wavelength. We guide it through this conical lens to convert it into a hollow cone beam because laser light is kind of expensive to get. So we want to utilize every bit of it as much as possible. And this kind of geometry allows us to use most of the energy we can get from the laser. So once we generate photoacoustic signals from the trunk of this small animal, we use a full-ring ultrasonic transducer. So this full view gives us the best image quality. Otherwise, you would get this partial view artifacts. We follow the Nyquist sampling criterion. In other words, we like to sample at half lambda over 2, where lambda is the acoustic wavelength, to meet this Nyquist criterion. Otherwise, you would get sparse sampling artifacts. Photoacoustic signals becomes weak at very great depth. So if you want to image really deep in tissue, because the light still attenuates exponentially, and you really want to keep every bit of SNR you have. To maintain the SNR, the best way is to pre-amplify the signal as soon as possible. As soon as the signal comes out of the transducers, you pre-amplify before cable noise creeps in, where it's going to spoil your SNR. As we know, we cannot amplify SNR. We can amplify signal and noise together. And in fact, if you want to improve SNR, you oftentimes pay a price, limiting your bandwidth, for example. We use one-to-one data acquisition, so we have an equal number of 5 channels of data acquisition that allows us to provide single-shot data acquisition without any multiplexing. That will give us imaging within a single laser shot within the acoustic transit time that allows us to get a cross-sectional image. Of course, the computer is going to acquire all the data and run the inverse problem to provide images. Here's a close-up. We have this hollow cone beam. We have this ultrasonic focused, cylindrically focused transducer for elevational resolution, but the in-plane resolution comes from the spherical inverse readout transformation. Of course, the system can be easily reconfigured for brain imaging. Here we use a diffuser to generate a solid cone beam as opposed to a hollow cone beam. So for brain imaging, we just use a solid beam to illuminate the brain. And the rest of the system is very much the same for acoustic detection and image reconstruction. Just to give you some idea about the type of images we can get. The red line shows the current cross-section being imaged. And as we scan across, we're actually repeating a laser pulse at 50 hertz. We have 50 hertz frame rate, whole body photoacoustic CT imaging of a mouse in vivo. And you can step through different cross-sections and see different features. For example, right now we just showed the left and right kidneys, and you can see symmetrical features. And the close-up shows different organs. Right now it's showing the heart. And you can even see some of the lung structures as well. And mostly the superficial layer of the lung, the liver, portal veins, for example. And the pharmas are extremely interested in this type of capability for drug discovery, for example. And these are all label-free imaging. We were so excited about the small animal data, we decided to scale up the system for human breast imaging. And you can see this bed with aperture roughly about 22 centimeters in diameter, and this diameter can accommodate most of the breasts, maybe up to 99% of all breasts. And for most of the breasts, you can squeeze a tiny bit against the chest wall, which is painless, to about 4 centimeters in thickness or less. So this system operates at the very top. It gives you about multiple centimeters penetration, hundreds of microns in resolution. You can get images like this. This is, in fact, color-coded 3D images of human breast acquired in vivo. This circle region shows the lymph region. A single shot, we get a single shot 2D image within 150 microseconds. Right after the laser pulse, we basically are limited by the acoustic transit time across the breast tissue. In this case, it's about 150 microseconds. So you don't really have any motion artifact for a single slice. Then for 3D imaging, we scan our ring transducer array away from the chest wall. We acquire 3D images within a single breath hold, 10 seconds or 15 seconds, depending on the human subject we image. And so this minimizes breathing-induced motion artifacts as well. The smallest vessels we can see is about 1/4 of a millimeter. And again, this is without any contrast agent injected. We're using blood as our endogenous contrast. We're using MRI, you have to inject contrast agents, typically gadolinium, heavy metal, and even then the smallest diameter is roughly about 1 millimeter. So we can actually image finer structures than MRI. The penetration is roughly about 4 centimeters in this case. And this is a demonstration of a few different slices at different depths, just to give you an idea about how deep the penetration is in a single laser shot without any averaging. So let me talk about photoacoustic microscopy, or scaling down to the microscopic level on that chart. Here we implement it differently. Instead of using the inverse spherical readout transform using computer, we're essentially using physics to do the inversion. And this photograph shows the first 3D photoacoustic microscope. So without getting into the details, let me show the close-up of the key components. We start with a optical illumination using a cone structure again, and we refocus the cone structure into the tissue. On the tissue surface, we have this donut-shaped illumination, so the core of the beam is dark. We made it dark intentionally to minimize the surface interference. The ultrasonic detection is confocal with the light focus, just to maximize the signal-to-noise ratio. With a single laser shot, we get a 1D image, very similar to the ultrasound A scan. Of course, we can raster scan in order to get a 3D image. So this system operates at this point. The first generation allows us to penetrate about 3 millimeters. It gives you tens of microns resolution. And we call this acoustic resolution photoacoustic microscopy. You can get images like this. This is part of our palm. We can see blood vessels quite well without injecting any heavy metal contrast agent. If you want to do X-ray angiography, you have to inject maybe iodine or other heavy metal-based contrast agents. And even then, you cannot really see small vessels because the contrast to noise ratio there was simply not enough. And you can get a B-scan image, and you can see the different skin structures there as well. We definitely understand the penetration limit of light. So sometimes you can endoscopically to access part of the structure in the body. So the GI tract, the colon, for example, the cervix even. And so this shows the first photoacoustic microscope or endoscope we built. And we're not going to get into the details of this system, but you can see the movie here shows the system in operation. We can acquire photoacoustic images, showing the contrast right here, up to about 7 millimeters in penetration, where standard optical endoscopy only looks at the surface of the GI tract. At the same time, we can provide ultrasound contrast. So this is dual contrast to begin with. You can do an automatic and mechanical pullback to get 3D images as well. We can advance our spatial resolution even further by doing something we call optical resolution. So this is where if we limit our penetration to about 1 millimeter, we can still focus light. So if we focus light to an optical wavelength limited spot, we can get optical wavelength limited spatial resolution in the XY directions. Where in the Z direction, you still depend on the acoustic time of arrival for resolution. In this domain, we can get even finer structures. We can do very rapid scanning. In fact, this image was acquired within 1 second. This is a 3D image showing the oxygen saturation. And that's basically a way of providing functional imaging. Using this system, we can image brain activation. So here you can see one-sided activation, and you'll see the other side activate right here. And so this could be a very useful tool for neuroscience studies. We can even push our resolution further to a much finer domain right here. We're imaging at organelle level. So, and this is an example. We're imaging mitochondria. At the very high numerical aperture, in the optical numerical aperture, basically you focus your light and try to focus as tightly as possible. We can achieve 234 nanometer resolution. But if you use photoacoustic nonlinearity, you can push the resolution to about 90 nanometers. This is actually the nanoscopic domain, and we call it super resolution imaging. And then you can see a comparison right here between the two domains. You're looking at essentially some of the internal structures of mitochondria. And that's an EM micrograph for comparison. Let me switch gears and talk about the other technique we're working on. So we've been working on the penetration problem for decades. Then we reminded ourselves, let's not forget about the fourth dimension because we live in X, Y, Z, and T. So we want to work on the time problem as well. The standard optical imaging speed is limited by electronics. You know, the electronics can only respond so fast. So we said, well, is there any way for us to conquer that problem? We decided to combine a street camera with compressed sensing, a modern form of really high-speed imaging with limited data you have. And so what you're watching is essentially the fastest images you probably have ever seen. This is the videos have been slowed down by 10 billion times so we can watch. And the camera actually functioned at 100 billion frames per second without repeating the event. This is our single event. So we're watching the entire event in real time. And so we're looking at the fastest phenomenon in the universe, essentially, at light transport. We're looking at the light pulse propagating in space, getting reflected, and there's a refraction between two different materials. And here there are two light pulses having a race in two different materials. And this is a single shot fluorescence lifetime imaging. In fact, we converted our camera into a two-color version, and the green pulse was for excitation, and the red is for fluorescence emission. You're looking at fluorescence decay, which occurs within about nanosecond scale, but since we slow down the movie so much, this feels like eternity. So if you're familiar with fluorescence lifetime imaging, which requires repetition of the events, it requires scanning, which takes quite a while to build the image, but here we're doing a single shot fluorescence lifetime imaging, and we capture the entire delay sequence. So the question is, how do we do it? And this is a very quick schematic showing the basic idea. We call it single shot compressed ultrafast photography, or CUP in short. The first generation provides 100 billion frames per second. Let's start with the object. We can describe the light intensity as I versus XY times T. Before we send this into a standard street camera, we actually send it to a DMD, a digital micromirror device. we write ones and zeros on the DMD, and that provides a mask. That's a pseudo-random mask that encodes our light pattern, and then the encoded light will be routed back to this beam splitter, and it'll route it back to this standard street camera. And so where we operate the street camera very differently is that we open up the slit as widely as possible, where the standard operation of a street camera is to use a very thin, narrow slit because the vertical dimension is used for time resolution. In order to image the white dimension, we have to open up the slit. But later on, we can retrieve the information as separate y and time t because of this mask. Once the photons are converted into electrons through the photoelectric effect, the electrons will be pulled back toward the back end. And then we apply this shearing voltage. There's a voltage ramp. Depending on the time of arrival of the electrons will experience different voltages. They will experience different shears in the vertical direction. So as a result, they will land at different vertical positions. This is a way of freezing time, essentially. So time has been converted into Y. And that allows us to take our time and detect the Y, and later on we can convert the Y dimension into time t. Of course, we're also receiving the original Y information, so we have a mix between the original Y and time t. We have to unmix them. In the back end, we convert all the electrons into photons again, and we use a standard CCD or CMOS camera to receive the images. Mathematically, we can write it as the energy matrix detected by the CCD camera, E versus XY, and which actually can be used to convert this I, initial intensity, into E through three operators. And so you have this coding matrix right here, you have the shearing operation, and you have this time integration because the CCD camera has the exposure time. All we have to do is to invert this equation. If you look at this equation a bit more closely, you have a problem, because xy is 2 dimensions, and on this side we have 3 dimensions, x, y, and time t. And so you have more unknowns than you have measurements. In general, you cannot solve this equation. However, in reality, for a movie we capture, there's sparsity. So we use compressed sensing to solve this equation. In the end, we get a movie like this. We push the technique even further right now, so we've just reached 10 trillion frames per second. And this is a comparison with the original version, you get this movie. And so here the length scale is 10 times shorter, and we get more frames. This system actually operated at 2.3 terahertz. And you can see a smoother movie here as well. You can see this light pulse. It'll disappear in the glass. We have scatter medium to siphon the photon sideways so we can see the light pulse. Once the light enters this glass, it becomes invisible for a while, but it'll come out the other side later.
It's not.
So let me discuss where we're going with our technique. And let me start with the technical caveats. So there are always different technical challenges we have to pay attention to, otherwise we're not going to get good images. And so this is, first of all, you can see the images right here. Right? This is a snapshot of the images. The full view is actually very important. It allows us to get minimized motion artifacts. And as a demonstration, we artificially truncated part of the views. You can see when you have a tiny view, you have good images within a smaller region. As you close up the full view, you get better and better images. So whenever possible, you want to use the largest view angles, but sometimes in reality you're limited to your view angle due to the anatomy, for example. The other aspect is Nyquist. We're all aware of the temporal Nyquist criterion, but there's also a spatial counterpart, and we have to observe as well. And if we do sub-Nyquist sampling, we're going to have streaking artifacts. So this is 512 is the full Nyquist. And if you start with 32, which is severely undersampled, and you have a lot of artifacts, as you double, you get better and better images. And so you always pay a price. We definitely understand that with compressed sensing concepts, sometimes you can overcome some of the problems, but usually we pay a price. For example, we give up the spatial resolution. The frame rate is very important. because when you image live animals or humans, there's always motion, and we have to beat the motion. We have to be fast enough in order to beat the motion. And this is working at 50 hertz. You can see the motion, the magnitude of the motion. If you acquire data slower than that motion, you got a problem. You will see a lot of blur around. We can use hemoglobin, again, an endogenous form of contrast, to do all sorts of functional imaging. And this is where we image resting state functional connectivity. The two sides of our brains are connected all the time, even at rest. And so this is where we show the two sides, how they are correlated, through the hemodynamic detection. And we try to push functional imaging to the extreme in terms of temporal resolution. And this is where we did a small animal study. You can see how quickly there's a wave coming in with stimulation. Here we did pulse stimulation. In mouse brain, you can see this wave of response. And we showed here oxygen saturation of hemoglobin, the total concentration of hemoglobin. Now, if you plot this signal versus time, this is the fractional change of oxygen saturation and total hemoglobin concentration. The oxygen saturation responds much faster, and this is the initial response we can see. In fact, at about 40 milliseconds, we can see the initial onset of this dip of oxygen saturation, where this total concentration signal comes much later. There's overshoot here as well. These two peaks actually are aligned. And this is where functional MRI detects, right, the bold, so-called bold signal. And in fact, we can potentially image much faster than the bold signal. So this is a very exciting area, and we're working on. And this is also a single impulse. We're not repeating any of the impulses. It's just a single impulse. We watch essentially the impulse response in terms of the hemoglobin signals. Now, obviously, for breast imaging, we want to use this to image breast cancer. And so photoacoustic tomography, it turned out later on, we can also use this for elastography. And this is one example. It's a radiographically dense breast. In fact, X-ray missed that tumor, but ultrasound detected tumor. You can see this piece of metal, which is placed outside of the skin, just to label where the tumor is. So we took another mammogram just to show the dot right here. And using our device, for reference, that's the nipple region. You can see this double arrow pointed region where the tumor is. This is a vessel density analysis showing the tumor. And in fact, we can look at the staining as well. So this is a form of elastography, and that gives us second contrast to give us better diagnosis. We can use this to image the extremity as well. You can see different part of the extremities. We can see blood vessels very, very well. And there are a number of applications we have in mind. Any vascular diseases, if you want to observe the vascular with single vessel resolution without injecting any contrast, or you want to look at oxygen delivery, this might be the choice. This is hot off the press. I received this data this morning from my lab. And so by no means have we reached the limit of our technology. I still think there's a lot of room for improvement, and this is where we're showing images of human breast again, showing quite high resolution of blood vessels with 3D resolution. We're not the only group working on breast imaging. Canon has done some really fantastic work. You can see their image quality is also very, very high using their system. Right now, they don't have a single breath hold system, and it takes multiple minutes to acquire a data set using their system. We're also targeting some other human clinical applications. Sentinel lymph node mapping is a technique we're trying to work on as well. And so the standard practice is surgery. We're trying to convert this into needle biopsy. We inject dye into the breast. Dye will be accumulated by the sentinel lymph node, and so it becomes bright to photoacoustics. And we use photoacoustics to see the contrast agent accumulated at the sentinel lymph node. We can also guide the needle to take some tissues out, and then we can analyze and see if there's cancer in the tissue. And so this is some of our initial tests in collaboration with Philips. You can see the lymph node due to the accumulation of the dye. And that's a movie showing part of the process. The other application is to observe oxygen delivery to the brain during surgery. So we can observe the common carotid artery and just look at oxygen saturation, as well as the jugular vein. And one goes in, one goes out, so the difference will tell you how much oxygen has been extracted. And this is obviously a very important parameter. We image healthy human volunteers, and that's actually in agreement with the expected values of oxygen saturation. Now, to push it to microscopic imaging, we try to push oximetry to the single cell level. And this is a system working at 1 hertz for demonstration, 20 hertz. In reality, we operate 200 hertz. And so that gives you about 20 3D images in real time. You can see single red blood cells. We can also look at our own finger cuticles. In fact, we use 2 different laser wavelengths to look at oxygen saturation. And you can see how the color varies as oxygen is delivered in our own capillaries. We singled out one of the cells and watch the oxygen release. So this provides a fundamental tool for physiologists to study oxygen delivery at the lowest level possible. There are a number of techniques we can develop as well, ex vivo. We all know that seahorse is a standard tool used by biologists and cancer biologists to study oxygen consumption, but they can only study a group of cells because they don't really have the right sensitivity to analyze a single cell, or they don't have the throughput either. So here we use micro wells. We load 1 cell per well. In fact, we have thousands of wells, and we can image them really fast with single cell sensitivity. We can get a distribution like this. We look at, basically it's a histogram of oxygen consumption rates. And this is from normal cells. This is from human breast cancer cells. And you notice here, cancer cells have a higher oxygen consumption rate and also has a broader distribution. It doesn't really follow the normal distribution either. In fact, the normal cells follow much more closely to a Gaussian distribution. I've so far demonstrated most of the images using hemoglobin as the contrast, but we can image other forms of absorbers as well. Melanin is another major absorber, so we can see this dark spot on the skin, but we really don't know the depth. And this is due to melanin. So ultrasound image doesn't really see that very well. This is actually a melanoma with lots of melanin. But using photoacoustics, we can see that quite well. We can actually see the 3D structure that's overlaid between the 2 images. We can get this depth. This is a very important parameter. Pathologically, they take a piece of tissue out, they measure the depth. That's called Breslow's depth. It's a parameter that's used to indicate the stage of the melanoma. And so we can actually get a vivo parameter of that, Breslow's depth. This is all ex vivo because there's distortion during the histological process. You don't really get a vivo parameter using the standard technique. We're also trying to image circulating tumor cells. And this is an example where we took our device to the clinic. We're imaging a melanoma patient trying to detect a single cell. And you can see this dot flying through. And there's actually a doublet flying across the field of view as well. So we picked a wavelength where melanin absorption is orders of magnitude higher than blood absorption. So this signal really stands out. Nothing in our normal blood will give us a bright signal like this. You can image normal control subjects, you never get a bright signal like this. We did tons of ex vivo imaging as well to validate this type of signals. We can also image DNRA. Now notice that this is going to give you contrast of the cell nuclei. So we can get essentially HE staining images, equivalent HE staining images without staining the tissue. So this is a photoacoustic image. You can see this normal region, you can see this breast cancer region, right? That's a close-up from here and here. And so our pathologists can make diagnosis out of our images already. If you compare with the standard HE staining images, you can see how well they are correlated. And so our technique doesn't require labeling when we can image even without cutting. So give me a fresh piece of tissue, we can start imaging right away. We can scan really fast. And so hopefully we can provide an intraoperative demarcation tool for surgeries. You can use this to image a brain. So this is a very interesting area for brain initiative. And so you can image all sorts of contrasts. This is an example where we see DNA, and we can see hemoglobin as well. And we can even see lipids. That's a combination of all sorts of contrasts. You can see these axons, different regions of the brain. Now, we all understand that in optics, the mid-IR wavelength is of great interest. So, because that gives you the so-called fingerprint region, right? Because by detecting the vibrational levels, you can differentiate all sorts of molecules. But mid-IR has a very long wavelength. That has a problem. And there's also water background issues. So is there any way to overcome those fundamental problems in mid-IR imaging? So what we do is use photoacoustics. And so we use a UV wavelength. You can use a shorter visible wavelength as well if UV becomes a problem for you. And so we get a PA signal. Let's call that PA sub UV1. Now we fire a mid-IR pulse. This is a much broader pulse because the wavelength is longer. If you want it, you can get a second PA signal. Now, what's important is we follow up with another UV pulse. We call that UV2, then you have a second PA signal, PA UV2. If you look at the fractional change of the PA signal in response to the exposure due to the mid-IR, and so this fractional signal will be proportional to the mid-IR absorption. As a result, we're getting a mid-IR signal with this UV resolution. So we're combining the UV resolution with the mid-IR contrast. And you can see images. These are based on the mid-IR signals. And these are based on UV signals. You can see much finer structures. And this one might be easier for us to tell the different levels of structures. And so this is becoming a very exciting field. And in fact, within months, this technology has been licensed to a company for commercialization. So we can also use exogenous contrast in addition to endogenous contrast. And this is still an example where we use endogenous hemoglobin to provide an image of hypoxia, a signature of tumor. But here we can use molecular contrast agents to image integrin. Right? This is a hallmark of angiogenesis, another hallmark of cancer. You see dual contrast. So this is, in fact, a form of molecular imaging. Right? This is widely adopted terminology by the Molecular Imaging Society. Another comparison, again, let me start with the functional imaging features, showing hemoglobin, similar to fMRI, bold MRI. But very similar to PET, we can image a glucose analog. So this is imaging glucose uptake using photoacoustics right here. And you can see the versatility of photoacoustics by leveraging all sorts of contrast mechanisms. You can even image gold nanoparticles. These are gold nanocages. And the bare form of gold nanocages are accumulated around the tumor. You can see how well the accumulation is due to the extravasation of tumor blood vessels. We also have a targeted form of nanocages, right, which can enhance the contrast by threefold. So this is going to target a hallmark of melanoma, MSH, that allows us to enhance and be more specific as well. You can couple this with therapy if you can imagine this as well. So there are a lot of things we can do with exogenous contrast. And there are also genetical encoding. So this is a genetic form of imaging. And in fact, through our collaboration with our collaborator, and we can make this protein switchable. You can slice to switch on or off the light absorption, so you got two states. An on state, we have the protein signal plus the background. An off state, the protein signal is gone, we only have the background. But if we subtract the two signals, we recover the protein signal. And you can see that quite well. So sometimes the protein signal may not be so strong relative to the hemoglobin background, and using this technique, you can suppress the background. And that's an overlay of this image. And this is even more recent work. And so our collaborator wants to image some micro robots. And we can track micro robots through light absorption. So the robots are loaded with some light absorption mechanism. And we can track the micro robots in the GI tract to see how they migrate. This move was acquired over like 7 hours. So this is a very slow migration in the GI tract. The toughest problem we have left in photoacoustics is probably adult human brain imaging, because here we have a human skull, which is quite thick. It's going to aberrate the acoustic wavefront. It's going to attenuate the signal as well. But we've demonstrated ex vivo there's sufficient signal for us to detect. The good news is that the acoustic wave, in our case, propagates only one way out. But we do have light attenuation on the way in. So it is challenging, but we've shown some feasibility. We started in vivo imaging already. You can see this healthy volunteer. And we took an MR image of this volunteer. And that's the brain part of the signal. And you can see our photoacoustic images. This is definitely very, very encouraging. And this is another image acquired more recently. And so our next step is to de-aberrate the acoustic wavefront, try to sharpen the image, try to tease out the deeper signals from the shallower signals. As far as the ultrafast camera is concerned, we're using this for some fundamental physical studies, as well as some applications. So I talked about this sonic cone, where we can see it. When this plane flies supersonically, you have this sonic cone structure. But when a light pulse flies superluminally, faster than the speed of light in material, you will get a cone structure as well. And this is the first time ever we observe this in real time. And so we're observing this cone structure at light speed. We all know that chaos is a very important physical problem, but right now there's no tool for real-time study of chaos, because fundamentally speaking, when you have a chaotic phenomenon, it's not repeatable. So how do we observe that in real time? And this is a pulse. This is take one. We have a cavity. This is a chaotic cavity. And so this is take two. If you actually overlay the two of them, you'll see that the two light pulses travel together initially, but over time they'll start to separate. You can see the separation right now. And we can also build a gate. This is light-speed gate. We can switch on and off at the width of the light pulse, picosecond scale or even femtosecond scale. And so when the gate is on, the pulse can come back to the other side of the cavity, and you can actually close off that later as well. So now we finally have this tool, and that can be used to study the very fundamental phenomenon of chaos. Now I know this community is very interested in shockwave, acoustic phenomenon. So the big question is, can we observe this in real time without doing pump probe? So we want to do single shot observation of this shockwave. It doesn't really provide you intensity contrast. Our first generation cup camera only images intensity, but now we build a version that allows us to image phase contrast as well through interferometry. And so you can see here, this is essentially a micro bubble, a small bubble, and you can see the wavefront propagation. This is basically phase contrast, acoustic phase contrast, gives optical contrast as a result, because the optical refractive index will change due to this shock front propagation. And you can see the propagation. It's actually here supersonic. So we actually concatenated 4 different sequences just to give you a long-term observation of this shock front propagation. Very similar to radar, we can also use this very fast camera for LiDAR detection. Let's say we have this scatter medium, we use that to simulate like a cloud, for example. We want to see a moving airplane behind this cloud. Can we do that? So we basically put our camera on this site with our light pulse. We detect the light echo. In the end, we can see this flying little airplane as well. In fact, the Air Force just announced this request for proposal based on our technology only. So they want to use this for the next generation LiDAR technique. The current LiDAR requires some sort of scanning, so it's kind of slow. It's more or less a pound probe, they do point scanning to form an image. So let me close by disclosing my financial interests with different companies. which have been commercialized photoacoustics, and we've been generously funded by NIH, NASA, and March of Dimes. Also, for more information, please visit our website. We have a couple of books giving you more details about photoacoustics and also biomedical optics in general. I need to thank Caltech for building me a dream lab. So you can see this is one of the floors of our lab. We have nanoscopic imaging at the proximal end. We transition by limb scale. At the back end, we do human breast imaging, whole body, small animal imaging. Credit goes to my lab members who really worked very hard to provide me all those exciting results for me to present. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lihong, for that wonderful presentation. We've got time for a couple of questions.
So the question is about the human brain imaging through the skull, especially about acoustic aberration. So this is a very challenging problem. We're actually learning from this community as well, because there has been some wonderful work in opposite direction, where this community has tried to focus ultrasound into the brain, which is also a long way. So we're trying to detect acoustic wave through the skull. So one approach we've been taking is to use X-ray CT images or even MR images. Through the CT number, we can get acoustic properties, and we have the geometry. And so we basically model everything in the forward problem. And then when we detect acoustic waves, we try to use the forward model to correct for the aberration, as well as the attenuation. Because when you attenuate, you have to compensate for that to get the best image. Otherwise, you have essentially a partial view problem, because only the strongest signal will contribute to the images. The weaker ones are essentially suppressed. So this is a work in progress. We've seen some results already. Definitely it's far before completion.
I've got a quick question. I got the impression from your presentation that perhaps the most compelling and early clinical application would be in breast cancer. Is that your impression, or do you want to comment on that more generally?
So there are probably a number of applications, but breast imaging is probably a very exciting area. First of all, we don't deal with bone, right? So we don't deal with aberration. For the most part, our community has been treating soft tissue as a acoustically homogeneous medium to a reasonably good degree of approximation. Of course, you can measure the acoustic speed variation. You can incorporate that into the image reconstruction, but usually that slows down image reconstruction, so our field has not been taking that route yet in practice, even though there are papers already in that direction. So it has the right depth requirement, so light at the right wavelength, usually it's at the red or near infrared wavelength, provides adequate penetration for breast imaging. As we know that mammography still has severe problems, especially in specificity. And so this is where contrast enhanced through gadolinium MRI plays a key role. So we want to basically leverage that kind of property. We can image blood vessels even better than MRI with contrast. We basically use hemoglobin without injecting any contrast agents. Gadolinium, although it's FDA approved for human use, but it still has side effects. So if we can avoid, especially repeated injection of gadolinium, and we see that breast imaging has some role to play. So that's why multiple parties in our field have been working on this problem.
Okay, very good job. So may I ask about the more function images, such as flow imaging or elasticity, or could some comment compare OCTA? They can get a very good vessel image, right? So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Han. Functional imaging is obviously a very interesting area. Just like any waves, I didn't have time to talk about this. Photoacoustic waves actually have a Doppler effect. And so when there's a flow, there's a frequency shift as well. And if you look at the equation, there's the difference lies in the factor 2, where in pulsed ultrasound, you have this factor 2 in front of your equation because it's a round trip. For photoacoustics, it's just 1. The factor is 1. But there is an appreciable amount of Doppler shift that has been used to detect blood flow. So the elastography I talked about very briefly about, that's where we basically, as we know, elastography can be implemented through probably any imaging modality. So you just need to have features where you can track and you can figure out the strain. And so since we acquire images so fast, we ask the patient to breathe normally, and then we can track the 2D distortion of blood vessels. By analyzing the blood vessel distortion, we can figure out the strain. In fact, the tumor has quite a different strain than the surrounding normal tissue. If I understand you correctly about the third question, which is OCT, optical coherence tomography is an optical counterpart of pulsed ultrasound. It gives you fantastic images, so the best application is in the eye. However, the penetration is very limited because OCT is still considered a ballistic form of optical imaging. It depends on the straight propagating photons. And so once you go beyond a millimeter with the exception of the eye, and OCT simply cannot provide image resolution.
Is there any quick final question? So in that case,
besides the neutralized brain functions associated with blood flow, is it possible to do a high kind of laser to neutralize neurons in each
2 meters.
Thank you. So the question is about neuroimaging, whether we can, in addition to hemoglobin signals, whether we can image neural signals. That's a topic we've been discussing, but so far the question is what kind of contrast can we depend on? We thought of maybe by tuning the laser wavelength, we can image other type of contrasts, so like lipids or water. So we've been exploring, but so far we haven't seen anything conclusive yet. But this could be a very exciting direction.
I have a question about your measurement of glucose in tissue.
Mm-hmm.
Is that in the tissue or in blood vessels? And does it require flow?
Actually, so we image a glucose analog. It's actually a dye called a 2MB-DG. And so we're imaging the dye absorption. That's not necessarily in the blood vessel, so because usually the cells will uptake 2MB-DG, very much like glucose uptake, and so that's just the glucose analog. We don't need to require flow. We just see the dye directly.
thank you. So I think, in conclusion, I think we should all thank Lihong Wang again for an outstanding presentation and for making the very long trip to come over here to Glasgow.